Welcome back, everybody. We've got a fantastic session planned for this afternoon, and there's absolutely no better way to kick it off than with a medal awardee. So I'd first of all like to introduce Bob Hilton, who's going to introduce our awardee.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. It's an absolute pleasure to be introducing here the Berner Lecture. The Berner Lecture has been running since 2017. Is awarded, co-awarded by the European Association of Geochemistry and the Geochemical Society. And the idea behind the lecture is to recognize Bob Berner's intellectual legacy in geochemistry. His work focused on these elemental transfers and biogeochemistry at Earth's surface, using a whole range of geochemical techniques, concentrations, speciation, isotope systems, really to tackle some of the biggest questions in geochemistry and surface processes as well. And so it's an absolute honor to let you know that we have this lecture by Valier Galy, who is the awardee of this 2013 Berner Lecture. Valier, a tenured associate scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, following his PhD at CRPG Nancy, not too far away from here. I'll just add, before we go any further, that I'm not actually part of the Berner Lecture Committee, or nor had anything to do with the nomination. And the first I heard about this was, I don't know where I read it, was absolutely thrilled, because Valier is a fantastic scientist, very close colleague and very close friend, and I got to know him very well over the last few years. So when I was asked by Josh West, who's one of the committee members, who's currently on fieldwork in Peru and sends his apologies, to do this, I was absolutely thrilled. So just to say some words about Valier's research, we'll hear about this in the next 20-25 minutes. He's tackled these big questions, tracing organic carbon from the high Himalaya through to the Bengal fan seafloor, and establishing how this erosion of the Himalaya is impacting global carbon cycling. He's looked at novel insight into how soil organic matter reservoir has changed in the past. This is a massive stock of carbon, and trying to quantify the residence time of that Earth's surface. It's really fantastic work. He's also developed novel methods to actually quantify reactivity of organic matter, but also its age. And this technique is we're now seeing it being rolled out to a whole range of different earth sciences applications. So from these big picture questions about the carbon cycle and geochemistry through to their work in making new methods for us all to use and expand on. Also, just to say, I've heard from people in terms of his mentorship of his students, but also many of us know he's also welcome to visiting students and visiting postdocs. He's always really enthusiastic to have people come through his lab, and he gives them that, his time in training them in these methods, and also in his really unique insight to spot some cool things in his data sets and in his science. So yes, without further ado, let's give Valier a massive round of applause for this prestigious award. And then this is where we hope he's on the other side of the call.
Thank you so much, Bob. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for the kind invitation, Bob. That's greatly appreciated. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I can't see you, but I imagine you're in a small, overheated room, just like every time at Goldschmidt. So it's my great pleasure to receive and give this Berner Lecture this year. Bob Berner has been a fantastic inspiration for many of us, myself included. I vividly remember in 2007, as I just finished my PhD, he reached out to me after the Bengal fan carbon burial paper came out, and wanted to chat, and had some really interesting, insightful comments about the work, and for me that was very important. Of course, I also want to mention all of the key contributors, some of which are listed here on the slide for this work, and over the first 15 years or so of my career. nothing would have been possible without, all of these collaborations, all of the, students and visitors and postdocs that Bob mentioned that have been coming through the lab. This has been a fantastic ride, and really this has been instrumental in getting all that work done. Okay, so today I want to jump right into the subject, and if I can advance slides, here we go. And I want to spend the next 20 minutes or so, or 25 minutes, talking about the regulation of the long-term atmospheric carbon and oxygen cycles. And I put oxygen in here because you'll see when we talk about organic matter, then oxygen comes into play. So this is something to keep in mind. We're not just talking about CO2, but also atmospheric oxygen. So this is a nice picture that I actually borrowed from one of Bob's paper. And what this shows is the different processes, surface and deep processes, that impact the atmosphere in terms of its long-term composition, carbon and oxygen concentrations. And so you've got the key players here, the sources on the left, volcanism, obviously, but also the weathering of petrogenic organic carbon and the oxidation of sulfide coupled with carbon weathering. And then you've got the sinks on the right, the barrier of biospheric carbon, and the silicate the weathering of silicate minerals coupled with carbonate precipitation in the ocean. What's really interesting here is that all of those processes in the red box, the surface processes or shallow subsurface processes, are all fairly tightly coupled with erosion and climate. And this gives birth to all kinds of interesting forcings and feedbacks that we're going to be talking about. So the big question is, how does all work out? How do all these processes work hand in hand to eventually result in an atmosphere that has carbon and oxygen concentrations that are relatively stable over time and don't go crazy in either direction, yet allowing some very significant variations in both carbon and oxygen concentrations? I just want to mention very quickly, this is fitting since we are in Lyon, in France, that this is kind of all news in the sense that this fantastic publication by Jean-Joseph Ebelman in 1845, if you look on the right, and apologize in French, but it's actually fitting for a conference in France. This publication in 1845 mentioned all of the processes that I listed in the previous slides. In terms of processes that impact the long-term evolution of CO2 and O2 in the atmosphere. So that's pretty amazing. I encourage everyone, and especially the students, the younger folks in the crowd, to go check it out if you can. This is really interesting. All right, so if we look at the output of models that try to put all these processes together and simulate the evolution of carbon and oxygen in the atmosphere. This is Bob Berner's famous geocarb output over the Phanerozoic. You can see that typically those models allow for some really significant variations in both CO2 here in red, that's relative to present, so 1 is present, 10 is 10 times present. And also in oxygen, this is in percent O2, so you can see that we're over the Phanerozoic wobbling around 20%, but reaching almost 30% at times and down to almost 10% at other times. And so this is interesting to note that indeed, at least based on these model outputs, that allows for very significant variations in CO2 and O2 in the atmosphere. So it's not running away, but it's not constant and stable either. And so there has to be some imbalances between the sources and sinks to result in these variations. The other interesting observation from this plot is the obvious coevolution of oxygen and CO2. So it's one is not exactly the mirror image of the other, but at times it is close to be. And this points to the organic carbon subcycle as being one of the culprits for the variations here, because imbalances in the organic subcycle will impact CO2 and O2 in opposite directions. And the reason for that is because if you look at the organic subcycle, you've got the weathering of petrogenic organic carbon, which is a source of CO2 and a sink of oxygen long term. And you've got the counterpart, which is the burial of biospheric carbon in sediments, which is a sink of CO2 and a net source of oxygen. So if you imbalance these two, you're going to end up impacting CO2 and O2 in opposite directions. One interesting thing to note here on this cartoon is that the atmosphere is a small reservoir compared to many of the other reservoirs that are involved in the organic subcycle, in particular the so-called rock reservoir, if you want, which is ginormous compared to the atmosphere, but also the surface and subsurface reservoir, plants, soils, shallow marine sediments are all pretty large reservoirs compared to the atmosphere. So you can have pretty significant impact on the atmosphere by having rather small imbalances between the sources and sinks here because of the differential size of the reservoir. So for years, people have been trying to think of the carbon cycle, and Berner has been one of them. Here in this case, it's modeled after the work of Walker and others, trying to think about the long-term carbon cycle as network of processes in which you've got forcings and then feedbacks to provide regulation. So in this example, you've got tectonic activity and volcanism as long-term forcings of the atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and you have got a response of the carbon cycle through either directly climate or erosion that will impact the surface processes that we've talked about. And this will result typically in these models in a negative feedback that will tend to compensate or counteract the initial perturbation, either the increase from increased volcanism or increased tectonic activity. And so what I really want to talk about today is the detail of this. How does that really work? And where are we now in our understanding of these feedbacks and what is left for us to study? And so I start off with this a very classic paper from Josh West that very nicely shows the complicated interplay between climate and erosion rates on the efficiency of silicate weathering as a mechanism for sequestering or consuming atmospheric CO2. So I don't want to go into the details because the talk is on the organic carbon subcycle, but this work here shows nicely positive relationships between erosion rates or climate parameter, and it's complicated because one is not independent from the other, and the intensity of silicate weathering, and therefore by inference, the intensity of CO2 consumption through the silicate weathering mechanism. And this is something that's been talked about very extensively in the literature. So if we look at the organic carbon sinks, can we do something similar? And the answer is yes. We can plot the efficiency of biospheric carbon export by river systems against the erosion rates, here suspended sediment yield on the x-axis, and we find a striking positive relationship. So the higher the erosion rates, the higher the efficiency of organic carbon export to the ocean. And the interesting observation here is that this relationship is not linear. It's a power law with an exponent of 1.6, which is, of course, lower than 1, but still quite high, and we think reflects the decrease in carbon concentration with depth in soils. It is interesting to note that this relationship, even though not linear, is, as I said, quite steep. And in fact, if you think about the current suspended sediment yield would be around a little shy of 200 tons per kilometer square per year. And if you double it, that would result in a very substantial increase in biospheric organic carbon yield export. So with this, we can think about whether there is some geomorphic limit to the efficiency of organic carbon export by river systems to the ocean. And to do that, we can look at this plot here, where we've got on the left axis the residence time, and the x-axis the sediment yield again. So the open symbols here show the maximum residence time that is imposed by the size of the stoke, of the carbon stoke, and the erosion rate. So this is the upper bound where if you reach or cross it, you would start to deplete your carbon stock, your surface carbon stock, and eventually run out of carbon to export. And here on the bottom, the closed symbols are the actual total ecosystem turnover time, which is much lower than this limit, orders of magnitude. And in between, I plot all data. This is derived from fatty acid radiocarbon dating, because you can't use bulk radiocarbon ages to do that because of the mixing of the rock and member. So we use fatty acids as a proxy for the biospheric carbon. And what this plot shows here is that in most cases, if not all cases, there's this flyer here. I'm not quite sure what's about this guy. The actual data of the residence time of the carbon that's being exported are well below the maximum limit imposed by the geomorphology, if you wish, which is the combination of the size of the stoke and the rate at which you export it. So this means that you can keep increasing sediment yield a fair amount before you run into the situation where you are going to be depleting the carbon stock. And if we now look at the actual sequestration of carbon, which includes the burial of organic matter in sediments, not just its export and mobilization, we find this equally steep positive relationship with again an exponent of about 0.6. So this is CO2 sequestration yield as a function of erosion rates. And it shows this positive steep relationship that is, if you compare with silicate weathering, actually a lot steeper. And so that means is that, first of all, when you increase erosion rates, you will indeed increase the efficiency of carbon sequestration through both organic carbon burial and silicate weathering. But also at high erosion rates, the burial of organic carbon tends to dominate the carbon sinks. Okay, so this all seems to work out along the lines of those big theoretical models that I've been showing a few minutes ago. And indeed, if you go to the Himalayas, so a place where there is very significant, very high erosion rates, you can derive a net budget for the Himalayan orogen by summing all of the CO2 sinks here at the bottom and subtracting the CO2 sources at the top. And if you do that, you end up with the system being a net carbon sink of about 8.5, 10 to the 10 moles per year, which is about 10 petagrams of carbon per 1,000 years. So that's actually 10 petagrams of carbon per 1,000 years. Interestingly, 10 petagrams of carbon is about what we emit per year. So in 10,000 years, you compensate for 1 year of CO2 emissions. So that's actually very significant. If you run this for thousands, tens, and hundreds of thousands, let alone millions of years, that's a very significant amount of carbon that's being sequestered. And the reason why the system is so imbalanced is because of the size of the burial of the biospheric carbon. Great. Well, that all seems to work very simply then. And of course, you can see it coming. There is a but. If I now turn to another example of a very high erosion rate landscape, which is the island of Taiwan, I get a very different picture. So the same exercise of trying to derive a net budget by taking into account all of the sources and sinks, results in the Erosion probably being a net long-term carbon source. It's rather small because the island is small in area, but that still puts the Erosion, the Taiwan island, into the carbon source category. Okay, so that's a problem because we've been going to two places with very high erosion rates. One is a source, one is a sink. And so this idea that increasing erosion necessarily will increase carbon sequestration clearly is not that simple. And the reason for this is that if you look at the efficiency of petrogenic organic carbon weathering on the left and pyrite weathering on the right, they also are positively related with erosion rates. So as you increase erosion rates, you increase the efficiency of carbon consuming surface processes, but you also increase the efficiency of the processes that emit carbon back into the atmosphere. And these two, in this case, we don't have quite as much data yet, but certainly a lot of folks are working on it, as we do for silicate weathering and then burial of biospheric carbon. But one thing that emerges is that where you land on these clouds of data is highly dependent on the initial concentration, what I called OC0 and S0 here. So if you have terrains, rocks that are high in petrogenic carbon and pyrite, you will have a tendency to have very high fluxes of petrogenic carbon oxidation and pyrite oxidation, especially at high erosion rates. So, I mean, that is for the direct control of erosion. What about climate? This is one of Bob Berner's famous feedback diagrams. And you can see here, there's all kinds of different processes. There's CO2 here, O2, and then the climate parameters, temperature and precipitations are here in yellow. And you can see there's the obvious direct effect on the weathering of silicates, mostly through, the kinetic limitation of that. There's also, interestingly, a direct effect on the weathering of organic carbon. And by that, I suppose that is the petrogenic end member. But what about the direct effect of climate on the cycling of the biospheric end member and the efficiency of biospheric carbon burial? This is, in a diagram like this, a lot more difficult to express. So we have, much like people have for decades, for silicate weathering, we've been turning to rivers, modern rivers, and looked at the controls of biospheric carbon turnover in modern, large modern river catchments. And to do that, we've again used specific organic molecules to get rid of the mixing of the petrogenic end member and the nasty effect on bulk radiocarbon ages. And we can plot these carbon ages or residence time here on the left as a function of climate parameters. And it is really striking that if you look at fatty acids, these same biomolecules I've talked about a few minutes ago, their ages are very tightly coupled with mean annual temperature and precipitations in these large river catchments. Not only this, but if you look at other potentially controlling parameters like steepness, geomorphic parameters, and so on and so forth, you won't find much of a correlation. So really, what we find is that the temperature and precipitation have a very strong impact on the turnover of biospheric organic carbon in these river catchments. And that's not too surprising if we think of the degradability of organic matter in the context of an Arrhenius equation of sort, if you wish. So this is here a result of laboratory experiments of plant litter degradation over 10 years. And you can look at the relative decline of carbon amount over time, and you can invert that evolution here to calculate the distribution of decay rate constants that characterizes this organic matter pool. And if you do that, you end up with log normal distribution of decay rate constants. That means they have long tails with sigma of around 1 to 4. And when we look at our data, fatty acid ages, and compare them to soil turnover estimates from the soil science crowd, we find this positive relationship, and we can use the slope to try to estimate what would be the standard deviation of the distribution of the decay rate constants. And we find a value that is very compatible with this lab experiments. So that means that we have in this river system, modern river systems, the expression of the long-tail distribution of decay rate constants that characterizes organic matter. And what that means is that this long-tail distribution is going to be really sensitive to increase in temperature. Because if you think of the Arrhenius equation, for given increase in temperature, for instance, the increase in the rate constants is going to be proportional to the activation energy. So these highly supposedly recalcitrant components of the organic carbon, the pool of organic matter that sticks around for a long time, is going to be most sensitive to a given increase in temperature. Is this something that actually happens through temporal evolution of climate? Yes, because if we look at the last 20,000 years in the Bengal fan, we see a big drop in the residence time of the organic matter across the deglaciation as climate warms and becomes much more humid. So we see a direct climate effect on the cycling of biospheric organic carbon in the real world, and this is actually pretty obvious considering how organic matter degradation rates work. Now, this is short timescales. What about long timescales? Well, we can turn back again to the Bengal fan and look at the long-term record that we recovered during IDP expedition 354 in 2015. And this sedimentary record is extremely interesting for the question we're asking about a direct climate effect on carbon burial, because the erosion rates appear to be rather constant, at least through the last 5-6 million years. So we have a period of time with relatively constant erosion rates, yet the Earth is experiencing this massive climate transition with the initiation of permanent ice sheets at the North Poles and the initiation of large glacial and terrestrial variability during the Quaternary. Okay, so how does that work in terms of the efficiency of carbon burial? We can look at the amount of carbon, of organic carbon in these sediments as a function of their mineralogy, grain size, or a bulk sediment property. Here I'm using aluminum silicon ratio with the clays here on the right and the sandy material here on the left, the low end of this axis. And we can see that the dotted line is the river carbon concentration, the modern river carbon concentrations. All of the quaternary samples land on that same line, so high efficiency of carbon sequestration. But the Cenozoic pre-quaternary points, especially the clays, tend to be falling well below that model line. So much less carbon buried in these sediments. If we look at it, I'm going to skip this one out. We look at it against time. Here at the bottom, there is the last 5 million years of the record, and the average carbon concentration, or organic carbon concentration of these Bengal fan sediments. You can see that they increase over time from right to left, from about 0.3 to 0.55. So it's almost a doubling of organic carbon concentration in these sediments over the last 5 million years. And this happens, it's the red curve here superimposed onto the Lisicki and Remo benthic delta weighting forum stack in black. So this happens as the Earth experiences this very strong cooling between 4.5 and 2 million years. And as the climate variability increases and glacial and interglacial cyclicity establishes in the last million year or million year and a half. And here on the top is a compilation of recent PCO2 estimates for the time period. And you can see that the cooling is coeval with the lowering of the CO2 by about 100 ppm or so. And this is really striking that we have this big increase in carbon burial as we have this CO2 drop. So interestingly, if we look at climate variability as recorded in the same sediments using a proxy for monsoon intensity, in this case, the delta D of long chain fatty acids, you can see that we have very strong monsoon throughout, similar to the modern ones. But in the Quaternary, clearly, there's all kinds of data that suggest weaker monsoons, much like we see in a record of the last glacial maximum. So clearly, the variability of the climate that increases with the establishment of glacial and interglacial cycles is expressed in the intensity of the monsoon, and that seems to be related in the intensity of carbon burial. So we're in a typical chicken or egg situation where the climate is cooling, we are burying more carbon, and we're wondering if we're burying more carbon because the climate is cooling, or if the climate is cooling because we're burying more carbon. This is my final slide. And the budget, carbon budget for the Himalayan range 5 million years ago would look probably something like this, with the system being a net source because the intensity of the biospheric carbon burial sink is much lower, about twice lower than it is now. So we can think of this as showing a pretty strong climate impact on the carbon cycle. The problem is that this impact is opposite to what we've learned and what we would expect, in the sense that we have a big climate cooling, big climate transition towards a colder system, and yet we are sequestering more carbon. So this is actually, if anything, a positive feedback. And I leave it here. I just want to thank funding from NSF, also the Swiss federal agencies, and then many, many students, postdocs, staff members who made all this possible. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for the talk, Valier. We've got time for 1 or 2 questions, if there are any.
Hi. So I hope you can hear me from there. We're talking long distance, okay? Does marine primary productivity fit all of this? I didn't see the effect of marine productivity. I thought that actually dominated a lot of the carbon barrier in the world.
To repeat the question online, the question was asking about marine productivity and how this all fits into the story.
Yeah, that's a great point. Obviously, what I was talking about here is mostly the terrestrial carbon cycle. The marine productivity is also very likely to be sensitive to climate, perhaps more so directly sensitive to climate than the terrestrial system. And in the Bengal fan, though, I point out that this doesn't come into play because there's very little sequestration of marine carbon in there, but clearly that's something to take into account.
We probably have time for one more question if there is one.
So in your carbon budget, you showed us like the export of this discrete wood particles. You have more evidence that rivers all over the world export them, and there's efficient burial in marine sediments. Did you incorporate that in your biospheric and in your biospheric portion? Or is it just like, because it's just like an underestimation, right, of your carbon budget?
If you could please possibly speak into the microphone, it might be easier to hear online. Thank you.
Hey, Valier, great talk. So my question is for your carbon budget. You showed us that you have like this discrete woody particles exported, like not just like in the Bengal farm, but more or less more evidence is like that is like a prevalent feature of rivers. So did you incorporate like these woody particles that are rich in carbon into your budget already? If not, then it would be like an underestimation of the biospheric burial, right?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. The Bengal fan, we we are trying to incorporate it into the budget, but it is difficult. There's work ongoing to do that. I do think, short answer is, I do think that we are underestimating the global burial budgets globally. Many places, certainly, specifically, but globally for sure, because of undercounting these woody debris. Absolutely.
Based on your studies, do you have like an estimation if it's like an increase of 5 or 10%? Because you saw so many rivers here and so many rivers. Do you have like an estimation on top of your head?
The Bengal fan, it seems like it could be up to 50% in some of those turbidite units. But then we have to carefully look into how this is distributed throughout, which we haven't done that well yet. But it could be, yeah, it could be very significant.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. If we could give Valier one more round of applause, please. And the next